Hello to our dynamic audience for both sides of the bars. Today we're going to have a pretty special show. We're going to be talking about youth incarceration. And we have Dick Mendel from the Sentencing Project. He is an expert in this particular area. So really excited to have this conversation. So I'll do an intro for Mr. Mendel. So Dick Mendel is a senior research fellow for youth justice at the Sentencing Project based in Washington, D.C., which he joined in 2021. Prior to that, he spent more than 25 years as an independent writer and researcher on youth justice and other social justice issues. And, Dick, when it's your turn, of course, you can elaborate more on the contribution that you've made in this particular field. We know that the U.S. has the highest incarceration rates in the world. Youth incarceration is a very important issue, as many young people are getting entangled in our criminal legal system. Some of us have heard of the school to prison pipeline and the notion of locking young people up younger and younger. So that is why it is really right for us to have this particular conversation. So with that, I want to introduce our guest, Dick Mendel. So Dick, why don't you, I did a minor introduction of you. Why don't you elaborate a little bit more about yourself, and then we can get into the particulars of some of the reports, really, really great reports that you've been associated with over your time at the Sentencing Project, and probably when you were an independent researcher as well. So turn it over to you, Dick.
Hi, and thanks again for having me. So I've been writing about these issues since the mid 1990s, when there was the whole super predator scare, and I did some writing. Is it really true? And what really works to reduce delinquency and delinquent behavior among youth, and are the sort of get tough solutions really gonna make us safer? And all the evidence, increasing bodies of evidence over the course of the time I've been working, shows that really incarcerating youth, punishing youth, treating youth as adults, all those things make us less safe rather than more safe. And I've been researching and writing about this for a good long time. So why don't we just get into it, and I can tell you some of the lessons that I've learned.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So one of the things that has happened, obviously, is you've been putting out reports. One report is referred to as one is about why youth incarceration fails. Do you want to talk about that one first? Or I believe that there was one, because that one came out in 2022. There was one that came out in 2021. Would you like to talk about the one from 2021 first?
No, that was the first on youth incarceration. That was the first of our series.
That was the first of the series.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And if you want, maybe you can flash maybe the title of it, and you guys can click on the QR code if you want to link to it right now. And this was just a study, and I've been doing research. I've been for a good long time that shows this, but this was the latest update on all the evidence showing that why locking kids up doesn't work. And all the research shows that the outcomes are almost always worse. That when young people are found delinquent and sent to institutions, the recidivism rate is 70 and 80% after 2 or 3 years, very high. And when they do controlled research comparing like kids who get incarcerated versus not, the ones who get incarcerated typically do worse in terms of recidivism rather than better. There's also lots of research that shows that detention, like immediately, the equivalent of would be jail in the adult system, whether the young person is arrested, is locked up right after they're arrested and pending their trial, that also has very bad long-term and short-term consequences. That if you're placed in detention pending your court date, you're much more likely to be incarcerated after for the immediate offense, but you're also much more likely to be arrested and incarcerated for future offenses. So it tends to make things worse rather than better. Also, being locked up, it disrupts educational careers of kids, and it vastly increases their dropout rates. It harms their long-term prospects for employment, for education, and it also damages their health and their mental health. One of the things that we find also is that these facilities are just not safe, and it's increasingly bad right now, where there's huge staffing shortages going on in a lot of the facilities, and it's exacerbating a trend. I did a study back in 2015, and more than 40 of the states had findings of recurring systemic maltreatment of young people in their facilities, more than 40 states, and a bunch more since then. So it's really not a safe alternative. It's really not an effective alternative. It makes kids more dangerous and it damages their futures. So that was the research, the why youth incarceration fails. We actually looked at that report. It was sort of not just that it fails, but why does it fail? And the two reasons that came out were that many, many more of kids who get locked up, who get involved in the youth justice system, have traumatic histories. They've been traumatized and had terrible things happen in their lives, and that drives them, makes them more prone to or less able to resist the temptations or the dangers of delinquency. But putting them in institutions just re-traumatizes them. It makes them worse rather than better. There's also a lot of evidence that kids naturally, it's a time of experimentation. It's a time of troublemaking. Adolescence, I think we all know it. We all experience it. Most of us did it. Things that were troublemaking at that time, but most of us all grow out of it, and it's a process of maturation. The brain, it doesn't fully develop until age 25, and but gradually we develop the skills and maturity to resist temptations, to take perspectives, to consider others' perspectives, and all of those maturation processes are disrupted when we put kids in facilities. They don't get the chance to grow up. And that growing up is what takes most of us away from that delinquent conduct. And so we're actually taking kids in the wrong direction when we incarcerate them, rather than giving them the chance to grow up, to experience the rites of passage of adolescence. So that's why youth incarceration fails. That was the first of our steps.
That was the first one. So, and that was a mouthful. So the audience is definitely gonna have to slow this down and be like, okay, what you said was super important. I want to talk about a couple of the issues that you mentioned. You said that 70 to 80% of the youth who are involved in the system end up, use the term recidivism, end up recidivating. So that means that they're not doing better if they've been in the youth system. So can you talk
is
a little
among
bit
young
more?
people who are placed in correctional institutions as a result, as a consequence for delinquency. The studies typically show 70 to 80% of them in most states end up rearrested within 2 or 3 years.
Excellent. So they're ending up rearrested. Then that means, as we know, once a young person gets involved in the system, ideally we want them to go on and do well. We want them to go on and thrive as much as possible. But you're saying when they're introduced into the system, they're ending up much more likely to re-engage, to be rearrested, or to have continued involvement in the system. So that's a very high percentage of individuals. You're talking 70,
right. It just doesn't work. It's hugely expensive, and it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Putting kids in institutions. So, there are some kids who, some people, it's a very small number who are really too dangerous for us to allow to roam the community, and we're not, my organization and me, we don't believe that there should be we're not absolutists that no one should be incarcerated, but it should be very small. And because the effects of incarceration are very negative in terms of young people's capacity, growing their capacity to desist from delinquency, and also it harms their life outcomes very badly.
Excellent. And you also talked about the development of the brain. We send young people to incarceration, sometimes adult incarceration. We do understand through brain science research, as you said already, that the brain is not fully formed and developed until at least 26 years old. And instead, in knowing that we still are locking people up, what are the better options? What works better than incarceration? Now, you talked a little bit about alternatives to incarceration. What should we be promoting as an alternative to locking young people up?
Well, I think that again, we have two sets of solutions, and one are programs for young people who really do pose a threat, who really are involved in significant delinquency and shown a pattern. And it's still not necessarily true that incarcerating is necessary or better. In this report, what we call effective alternatives, maybe you can put up the cover and the QR code for that one too, effective alternatives to youth incarceration. We highlight 6 models that have been found in research to significantly improve outcomes for young people compared to incarceration. that have also support for replication. There's clear models and ways that you can implement these ideas. Those 6 are, one of them is called credible messengers, which which connect young people to people who from their communities, and many of them have also had involvement in the justice system, to work intensively with those young people. A second one is called youth advocacy programs, that also connects young people to mentors that work with them. And all of these programs, it's not just the connection to one person, but they provide support for education, they provide support, they provide employment, they provide family support and connections, they provide emergency assistance if families are in trouble, and they work with the whole family unit. There's also advanced times of family therapy that work with the whole family to understand and address dynamics within the family that can be leading the young person towards delinquency or not providing effective supervision and support. There's a program called ROCA, which is operating throughout Massachusetts and also in Baltimore, that it's not a court program, but it works with young people who are involved in the court and others who have been involved in gun violence. And the kids who are most young people, it's youth and young adults who are most likely to be involved in gun violence. They just assign community workers that are highly trained to engage those young people and to teach them the cognitive and behavioral skills, those maturity skills that I was talking about, to learn to stop, look, and listen, to think twice before they act and respond and retaliate, to develop perspective taking skills, and just to be able to sort of stop and interrupt that cycle of bad behavior. There's also restorative justice programs, especially ones that divert young people from the court entirely, where instead of having a court process where it's mostly about guilt or innocence and punishment, it's about restoring the harm and apologizing and repairing the harm that the young person has caused with their behavior. And those programs tend to have, again, much better outcomes. There's some wraparound care programs for kids with serious emotional disturbances who often get thrown into the justice system as sort of a default alternative because they don't get good mental health. They get in trouble when the court addresses them with punishment rather than with mental health. And there's also these are models that work, but there's also a lot of research that just says good programming at the local level, homegrown, can work just as well as these model programs if they follow some key principles, which involves working with the young person's family, working with the young person, teaching those cognitive and behavioral skills, engaging the family. I'm not sure if I'm providing alternative activities for the young person and positive connections. So those kinds of things tend to work even if it's not a model program that you're working with. So those are the kinds of alternatives that work better than, or have in many cases shown to be work better than, incarceration in terms of getting people on track out of delinquency and on track in terms of education and employment and life success.
Excellent. That's so important. One of the things that I've been studying at the Fortune Society is a topic called desistance, and we know from desistance that youth are, of course, much more likely to be involved in crime, but they have, as we know, the age crime curve, that by a certain point, young people, whether they start at 12, 13, 14 years old, have been involved in the system. By the time they get to 21 years old, they've completely desisted from their engagement in crime. So it sounds like what you're saying is that when we put them in these adult facilities and we treat them the way that we've treated them with this long-term and perpetual punishment, that the outcomes for these young individuals are just really, really bad. So
yeah, the best study that was ever done about young people in desistance looked at several hundred young people who were arrested for pretty serious crimes, and they tracked them over several years, intensively tracked them. And they found that 90% of those kids, or more than 90% of them, were not persistently offending several years later. They were not that they all completely desisted from it, but more than 90% were not a perpetual danger to society. It's just a very small number. 7%, 8%, something like that, of the kids who were arrested for very serious crimes continued to be committing serious crimes several years later. Like most people age out, but when we put young people into facilities, we take them away from the people they love, we deny them the opportunities to grow up and grow out of these behaviors, we tend to increase that number rather than make us safer, we make us more endangered.
excellent point. And you mentioned earlier about again, about correctional institutions, when the young people end up there here in New York and in other places. We've talked about raising the age of criminal responsibility. New York and North Carolina were like the last two states. New
Right.
York, we only passed our laws just a couple of years ago to raise the age.
Mhm.
And a lot of young people ending up in adult facilities and suffering from trauma,
Right.
suffering from abuse, and in the facilities not having restorative practices. So it's
Right.
very important what you talked about related to offering some kind of alternatives to young people,
Right.
especially not having them, end up in the system. What are some states and or localities doing to help improve and or provide much more effective systems for juveniles who do end up involved in the system?
So New York City has invested heavily in those credible messengers. All across the country, people are using these YAP programs, and sometimes these family therapy treatment programs. Massachusetts has invested in that ROCA program. The last of the reports that I wrote was talking about how sort of system reforms, not programs, but system reforms, and that's where the states have a lot of the responsibility for that. Maybe we can put up the last of the slides, and you can and this is again called system reforms. And a lot of the times the young people who get locked up in our systems aren't really the dangerous kids. They're kids who get in trouble and persistently in trouble, and they get put on probation. And the probation, they've got a lot of rules they got to follow, and they don't follow the rules, and they make the judge mad, or the system feels like they can't control the kid, and controlling the kid isn't necessarily what you need to do. You need to just keep the young person if they're not endangering the rest of the society. They really do much better if you keep them um, in in their homes with their families. You give them incentives to and encouragement and connect them to positive activities. They tend to do much better in the long run than if you incarcerate them.
Mhm.
In terms of um, things that states can do, some states have prohibited incarceration for lower level offenses. At least at the state level, in Texas has done this, California has done this, several states have done this. That they just say, unless you've committed really serious offenses, we're not going to lock you up anymore, and we're going to find something else to do with you. Some states have created, in Ohio, for instance, they have fiscal incentives. I mean, the local courts make the decisions, but the state pays for the state facilities. And so they've said, no, if you reduce the number of kids that you send to these facilities, you can keep the money for local programming. And it's really vastly reduced the number of young people who get incarcerated in that state. And there's other states have redirected savings from reduced incarceration towards community-based programs that work much better. There's mental health treatment for young people, because a lot of the young people who end up in the system are there, as I said, because they've got mental health challenges, and they act out, and then the system treats them as delinquent rather than mentally ill. So those are the kinds of things that states can do. Ohio's done a lot of this. Many of the states have really reduced their use of incarceration. I mean, overall, the good news in juvenile justice is that there were about 110,000 kids locked up on any given day 25 years ago, and now we're down to 27,000 or so. It's really much lower, but that's really a function that young people are actually behaving much better. There's very many fewer arrests now for serious crimes and for all crimes among young people than there were 25 years ago.
I mean, that is so encouraging, and our audience is really going to be super appreciative of the information that you're providing, because there's a perception out there often, Dick, that crime is run amok, and remember the term years ago, young people referred to as super predators, and that got a lot of traction. And every time, as we are now, where there's like a political campaign, it's like we start talking about crime and start talking about it in a way that's oftentimes inflated. All of us want safe communities, right? We want for young people to not be involved in crime. We want for adults to not engage in crime, what have you. But so this question is less about evidence than about perception, Dick. That perception that young people were super predators and are engaged in a hefty amount of crime, is that do a lot of people feeling that now? Because
The
again,
public
the
polling are
evidence
showing,
is
yes,
one thing. The evidence
much
is one
higher
thing.
fear at this point,
Yeah.
and it's really been it's since the pandemic, and there was a short-term spike nationwide in murders starting in 2020. That was worrisome, but it went. I mean, we've had dramatic reductions in murders over the last 25 or 30 years, and was a significant increase. But it started to abate now, and it's really there's a wing of the political world that has decided this is a huge opportunity. We're going to scare people about crime again, and we're going to get votes by being trying to be tougher and create fear and exploit that fear. But the trends have been very much mixed. There's been some crime categories that have seen increases. There's been some that have had decreases, and a lot of the ones that have increased have started decreasing recently. And you hear sort of crickets from the folks who've been complaining about crime that the increases, they're silent on the decreases. And some of the media has also been much more enthusiastic to highlight bad trends in crime and then to forget to come back and inform their audiences in prominent ways, in memorable ways, that those crimes have gone way down now. In Baltimore, I know they really had a tripling or so of the number of car thefts over the starting in 2022 through 2023, and almost that entire increase is abated now. But you don't hear that on the news. It was like an everyday news event that cars were being stolen, and then when that stopped, there was no more coverage of that. So people were still fearful because they've heard the bad news, but not the good news, and that's an
Exactly.
unfortunate trend.
That's an extremely valid point. When there's a time for politics and when there are elections, especially national elections, we start talking about crime in ways that are not necessarily honest. We need to really be honest with the public about what is happening and be able to talk in a way that's much more nuanced about the conversation related to crime. And I like that you mentioned the fact that you talk about 100,000 young people were incarcerated years ago, and now we're at a number that's closer to 27,000.
Right.
I mean, that's huge. I mean, I think about New
Mhm.
York. In 1999, we had over 70,000 people in prison. Now we have about 34,000, and the number keeps going down. So again, that's very important. And the fact that that's happening with young people is really, 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 really significant. What can our audience do if they wanted to get involved uh, with this particular issue? If they wanted to engage, I mean, you talked about restorative practices as something that is really helpful. I mean, we could do more restorative practices in our homes and in our schools, not
Mhm.
just in the criminal legal system. What do
Right.
you suggest as a way to work with young people who might be off on the wrong direction?
Well, I mean, I think that there's a lot of evidence that mentoring really makes a difference, especially if it's done right and lasting. You can't just sort of parachute in and parachute out. You have to really commit to it. But that's something that really you can make a difference. Working with your school and providing support to young people and advocating for. I mean, school to prison pipeline it's sort of a fancy word, but basically, when kids misbehave, do you want to treat that in the community and in school? Does it need to be a legal issue? Is the court the right place? What is the court's advantage in addressing young people's behavior? The only thing that the court can do that nobody else can do is punish, and that tends to be where the energy comes from the court. And what young people really need is mentoring. They need support. They need opportunities. They need caring adults in their lives. And the court doesn't have an advantage in providing those things, and they need support. Their families need support, and parents need help. And parents sometimes it can be exasperating to have teenagers. I've got teenagers. It's not always easy, and having support and parenting strategies and just support and respite and help for parents is very important. So community organizations that work with young people, they all need volunteers. They all need support. In your community and in every community, that's something that you can do.
Excellent. Again, very, very informative. And insofar as the systems are concerned, those were great suggestions. You talked about like credible messengers. Like I remember talking to colleagues, not just here in New York, but in DC and in Maryland, and they were talking about how, and I did a tour of the youth facilities in DC and some in Baltimore, and see how we're moving away from again, like a punitive approach,
Mhm.
credible messengers, like you mentioned, people who
Right.
have been involved in the system as young people. We're
Mhm.
all working with these young people and in trying to give them an outlet, listening to them in a much more constructive way. Any other thoughts about those system reforms as we, get close to wrapping up?
Yeah, I mean, that started to ask that question. I mean, most of the problem in the system is early on. It's
Hmm.
should we arrest this kid when they mouth off to the school resource officer at the school, or should there even be a school resource officer in the school? When they're arrested for when they engage in drug activities, when they're arrested. I mean, young people are arrested all the time for things that don't necessarily need to be a legal system response.
Or
And to
smoking weed or something like
yeah,
that. Hmm.
um, and keeping the court, and when they use sort of small time petty theft and trespassing, vandalism, there's tons and tons of lesser things that get all kinds of, I mean, huge numbers of kids get arrested and get into the legal system. And once they do, they have a target on their back. Everything they do, every mistake becomes heightened in terms of consequences. And so we need to keep kids out. I mean, there was a study recently completed that tracked young people who were arrested for the first time for sort of medium level crimes, and half of them were diverted and never thrown into the system at all, and half of them went to court. The ones who went to court did better on 0 out of 19 outcomes. The kids who were
Excellent.
diverted did better, substantially better on 10 of those outcomes, including less chance of rearrest, less chance of committing violence, less chance of being incarcerated. In terms of school and
Excellent.
employment, also keep kids out of the system. The system
Exactly.
is not good for kids. It's a toxic. It does
It's
not
a
provide
toxic,
what
it's
young
a
people
toxic
need.
environment.
And
Thank you.
so don't arrest them. Don't send them to
Yep.
court. And if you can
Yep.
avoid detaining, use detention minimally and provide alternatives to keep young people on track pending their
Let's go.
court hearings. All those things can really dramatically reduce the number of kids who get on that pathway towards incarceration.
Excellent. So we have to wrap up now. We're right at time. So thank you, Dick. This was a dynamic conversation talking about this particular issue. Appreciate your contribution. And thank you to the audience for being there with us today for this great conversation around youth incarceration in the United States.